The dusty trail into Quartzsite, Arizona stretched before Delilah Thornton like a ribbon of broken promises, each step of her weary horse bringing her closer to what she hoped would be a fresh start, though the scars that marked her body and soul told her that hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. It was late August in 1878, and the desert heat shimmered off the red rocks and sparse vegetation that dotted the landscape. Delilah pulled her bonnet lower over her face, not to shield herself from the sun, but to hide the long, jagged scar that ran from her left temple down to her jaw. The physical mark was just one of many that life had carved into her 23 years of existence. Her hands, wrapped loosely around the reins, bore burns from a fire that had taken her family's homestead 3 years prior. Her right shoulder carried the memory of a bullet meant for her father during a robbery that had left him dead and her an orphan. But the deepest scars were the ones nobody could see, the ones that woke her screaming in the night and made her flinch at sudden movements. Quartzsite rose from the desert like a mirage, a collection of weathered wooden buildings and canvas tents that served the miners, prospectors, and drifters who passed through on their way to somewhere else. Delilah had chosen this town precisely because it was the kind of place where people did not ask too many questions, where a woman alone might find work and anonymity. She had saved enough money from her last position as a laundress in Tucson to buy passage here and rent a room for a month while she sought employment. The main street was quiet in the afternoon heat, with most sensible folks taking shelter indoors. Delilah guided her horse toward the livery stable, her eyes scanning the buildings for any sign of the boarding house mentioned in the letter from a friend of a friend. The livery was a sturdy structure at the edge of town, its doors open to catch any breeze that might wander through. A tall figure emerged from the shadows of the stable, and Delilah's heart jumped in her chest before she could remind herself that not every man meant her harm. He was lean and broad-shouldered, wearing dusty work clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. As he approached, she noticed his steady, unhurried gait and the way his hands hung loose at his sides, non-threatening. "Afternoon, miss," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried a hint of Texas in its vowels. "Looking to board your horse?" Delilah nodded, not trusting herself to speak just yet. The man stepped closer, and she instinctively turned her face away, angling her scarred side into shadow. "Name's Quincy Thatcher," he continued, seemingly oblivious to her discomfort. "I run this stable along with some other work around town. How long will you be needing a stall?" "I am not certain," Delilah finally managed, keeping her voice steady despite the familiar anxiety that crawled up her spine. "I have just arrived and am looking for lodging and employment." Quincy reached for her horse's bridle, his movements slow and deliberate. "Mrs. Henderson runs a clean boarding house 2 streets over, the one with the blue shutters. As for work, depends on what you are looking for. Town is always needing seamstresses, laundresses, cooks. Can you do any of those?" "All of them," Delilah said, dismounting carefully. Her legs were stiff from the long ride, and she stumbled slightly as her boots hit the hard, packed earth. Quincy's hand shot out to steady her elbow, and she jerked away so violently that her bonnet fell back, exposing her face fully in the afternoon light. The scar stood out white and angry against her sun-browned skin, a testament to the violence that had shaped her life. She waited for the reaction she had grown to expect. The widening of eyes, the barely concealed disgust, the sudden step backward as if scars were contagious. In Tucson, the other women had whispered about her, calling her cursed and unlucky. The men had either avoided her entirely or looked at her as damaged goods, something to be pitied or taken advantage of. But Quincy Thatcher simply met her eyes, his own gaze a warm brown that reminded her of polished wood. He held her stare for a long moment, and something flickered across his features that she could not quite name. "You are going to want to get out of this heat," he said finally, his tone unchanged. "Let me get your horse settled, and I will walk you over to Mrs. Henderson's place. She is particular about her tenants, but she is fair." Delilah pulled her bonnet back into place with shaking hands, confused by his lack of reaction. "That is kind of you, but I can manage." "Did not say you could not," Quincy replied, already leading her horse toward a stall. "But Mrs. Henderson knows me, and a recommendation from someone local carries weight in a town like this." She wanted to refuse, to maintain the careful distance she had learned to keep between herself and others, but practicality won out over pride. She had limited funds and needed to secure lodging quickly. "Thank you," she said quietly. While Quincy tended to her horse with practiced efficiency, Delilah studied him covertly. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with sun-weathered skin and the calloused hands of a man who made his living through hard work. There was a quietness about him, an economy of movement that suggested someone comfortable in his own skin. When he finished with her horse, he retrieved her small traveling bag from the saddle and gestured toward the street. They walked in silence through the dusty lanes of Quartzsite, passing a general store, a saloon, and a small church with a crooked steeple. Delilah kept her head down, aware of the curious glances from the few people they encountered. In a town this size, a new face was an event worth noting. The boarding house was exactly as Quincy had described, a two-story wooden structure with faded blue shutters and a small garden struggling valiantly against the desert climate. The porch was swept clean, and lace curtains hung in the windows, speaking of a woman who took pride in her establishment. Quincy knocked firmly on the door, and after a moment it swung open to reveal a stout woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun. Her eyes were sharp and assessing as she looked from Quincy to Delilah. "Mrs. Henderson," Quincy said, touching the brim of his hat. "This is Miss Thornton. She just arrived in town and is looking for a room while she seeks employment." Mrs. Henderson's gaze fixed on Delilah with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. Delilah straightened her spine, meeting the woman's eyes despite her instinct to hide. She had learned that showing weakness only invited more scrutiny. "Can you pay?" Mrs. Henderson asked bluntly. "I can pay for 1 month in advance," Delilah replied. "I am a skilled seamstress, laundress, and cook. I intend to find work immediately." Mrs. Henderson sniffed, her expression skeptical. "Let me see your face, girl. I will not have any trouble under my roof." The request, though expected, still sent a jolt of humiliation through Delilah's chest. Slowly, she removed her bonnet, tilting her face so the landlady could see the full extent of the scarring. She kept her expression neutral, refusing to show the shame that burned in her stomach. Mrs. Henderson studied the scar for a long moment, then shifted her gaze to the burn marks visible on Delilah's hands. "How did you get those?" "A fire," Delilah said simply. "It took my family's home and most of our belongings 3 years ago. And the one on your face?" "A piece of falling timber struck me as I tried to save my younger sister from the flames." It was the truth, though not the whole truth. She did not mention that she had failed, that she had pulled her sister's lifeless body from the wreckage, or that the nightmares of that night still haunted her sleep. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I charge $3 a week, meals included. I expect my tenants to be clean, quiet, and respectable. No gentlemen callers, no drinking, and you will attend church on Sundays. Do you agree to these terms?" Relief flooded through Delilah so intensely that she felt lightheaded. "Yes, madam, I agree completely." "Good." Come inside, and I will show you to your room." As Delilah moved to follow the landlady, she glanced back at Quincy, who had remained standing on the porch. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Thatcher." He nodded, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "Welcome to Quartzsite, Miss Thornton. I expect I will be seeing you around." The room Mrs. Henderson showed her was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the struggling garden. It was more than Delilah had dared hope for, and she felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease as she set down her bag. "Supper is at 6, Mrs. Henderson informed her. "Do not be late." After the landlady left, Delilah sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself a moment to simply breathe. She had made it to Quartzsite, had secured lodging, and had encountered at least one person who had not reacted with horror to her appearance. It was more than she had accomplished in months of trying to find a place where she might belong, but she knew better than to let hope take root too firmly. People were often kind at first, before they learned the full extent of what made her different, what made her damaged. Quincy Thatcher's lack of reaction had been surprising, but she had learned not to trust kindness. It had a way of evaporating when people looked too closely. She spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking her meager belongings and washing away the dust of travel. When she made her way downstairs for supper, she found 4 other boarders already seated at the long dining table. 2 older men who worked at the nearby mines, a young schoolteacher named Miss Pritchard, and a widow named Mrs. Cole who helped Mrs. Henderson with the cooking. The meal was simple but substantial: beans and cornbread with a bit of bacon for flavoring. Delilah ate quietly, answering questions about where she had come from and what had brought her to Quartzsite with carefully vague responses. She noticed the way Miss Pritchard's eyes lingered on her scars, the quick whisper exchanged between the 2 miners, but she had grown accustomed to such reactions. It was Mrs. Cole, a kindly woman with worried eyes, who mentioned that the general store was looking for help. "Mr. Patterson's wife just had their 5th baby," she explained. "She usually helps in the store, but she is overwhelmed with the children now. He was saying just yesterday that he needed someone who could sew, since folks are always coming in with torn clothing needing mending." "I will call on him first thing tomorrow," Delilah said, grateful for the lead. True to her word, she presented herself at the general store shortly after dawn the next morning, dressed in her best calico dress with her hair pinned neatly and her bonnet in place. Mr. Patterson was a harried-looking man in his 30s, with flour dusting his apron and the exhausted expression of a new father running on minimal sleep. When Delilah explained that she had heard he needed help, his face brightened considerably. "Can you sew?" "Really sew, I mean, not just basic stitching." "I can," Delilah assured him. "I can also read and write, manage inventory, and deal with customers if needed." Mr. Patterson hired her on the spot, offering wages that were fair if not generous. The work would involve mending clothes, hemming trousers, sewing patches, and occasionally helping customers find what they needed among the crowded shelves. Delilah accepted gratefully, relief washing over her. With steady employment, she could afford her room and perhaps even begin to save a little. The first few weeks in Quartzsite passed in a blur of work and careful routine. Delilah rose early, worked long hours at the general store, and returned to the boarding house for supper before retreating to her room. She spoke to people only when necessary, kept her head down, and tried to make herself as invisible as possible. But Quartzsite was a small town, and invisibility was difficult to maintain. People grew accustomed to seeing her at the store, to the quality of her mending work, to her quiet competence. Some treated her with indifference, others with a sort of cautious curiosity, and a few with the barely concealed pity she had come to despise. It was Quincy Thatcher who surprised her most. He seemed to appear with startling regularity, always with some legitimate reason. Picking up supplies for the livery, delivering a message to Mr. Patterson, or checking on a saddle that needed repair. Each time he would nod to her politely, exchange a few words if she was not busy, and go about his business. There was nothing improper in his behavior, nothing that would give Mrs. Henderson cause for complaint, but Delilah found herself increasingly aware of his presence. He never stared at her scars or treated her with the excessive gentleness people sometimes used around her, as if she might shatter at any moment. Instead, he spoke to her the same way he spoke to everyone else, with a straightforward courtesy that felt genuine. One afternoon in early October, as the desert heat finally began to ease, Quincy brought in a leather vest that needed stitching. The seam along the side had split, and he handed it to her with an apologetic expression. "Can you fix this?" he asked. "I know you mostly do clothing repairs, but I thought you might be able to handle leather." Delilah examined the vest, noting the quality of the original stitching. "I can fix it. It will take me a day or two to do it properly. The leather needs to be conditioned first, or the new stitches will just tear through." "That is fine," Quincy said. "I am in no rush." He lingered by the counter, his hat in his hands, and Delilah realized with a start that he seemed uncertain about something. It was such an unusual expression on his normally calm features that she found herself asking, "Is there something else you need?" Quincy met her eyes, and she saw that flicker again, the one she had noticed the first day they met. "There is a harvest social this Saturday evening at the church. Dancing, food, that sort of thing. I was wondering if you might like to attend." The question caught Delilah completely off guard. For a moment she could only stare at him, trying to determine if she had misunderstood. "Are you asking me to accompany you?" "I am," he said simply. A dozen responses crowded Delilah's mind, but what came out was a bitter, defensive laugh. "Why would you want to be seen with me? Have you not noticed the way people look at me? I am scarred, Mr. Thatcher. Damaged. The women whisper about what bad luck I must carry, and the men see me as something to be pitied." Quincy's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "I have noticed the scars. I would have to be blind not to, but I do not see damage when I look at you, Miss Thornton. I see someone who survived something terrible and kept going. That takes strength." "Strength?" Delilah's voice rose slightly, drawing a curious glance from Mr. Patterson across the store. She lowered it again, but the emotion remained. "There is nothing strong about being marked as unlucky, as cursed. In Tucson, they said I brought death with me. My family died, my home burned. Anyone who gets close to me suffers." "That is superstitious nonsense," Quincy said firmly. "Tragedy happens. Bad luck strikes. But it does not make you cursed, and it does not make your scars something to be ashamed of." Delilah shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself defensively. "You do not understand. I have been rejected from 3 towns before this one. People hear about what happened to my family, they see my face, and they decide I am not worth the risk. I came to Quartzsite to be left alone, not to be someone's charity case." For the first time since she had met him, Quincy's calm demeanor cracked. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice carried an edge. "Do I look like a man who does charity? I asked you to a social because I find you interesting, because I admire the way you carry yourself despite the whispers, and because I would like to know you better. Your scars make you real, Miss Thornton. They show that you have lived through something most people could not imagine, and you are still here, still fighting. That is worth more than 100 unblemished faces." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way that made Delilah's chest ache. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that someone could look at her and see beyond the damage. But years of rejection and pain had built walls around her heart, and they were not easy to dismantle. "I do not know," she whispered finally. "I do not know if I can." Quincy's expression softened. He set his hat back on his head and nodded slowly. "That is fair. The offer stands if you change your mind. Either way, I will be by to pick up the vest when you have finished with it." He left the store without another word, and Delilah stood behind the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she held the leather vest. Mr. Patterson approached, his expression curious but not unkind. "Quincy Thatcher is a good man," he said quietly. "Lost his whole family to cholera when he was 19. Buried his parents, his 2 brothers, and his baby sister all in the same week. Came out here to start over, just like a lot of folks. He knows what it means to carry grief." The information settled over Delilah like a blanket, heavy and warm. She had assumed Quincy was simply being kind, that he could not possibly understand what it meant to be marked by tragedy. But if what Mr. Patterson said was true, then perhaps he did understand, perhaps better than most. The rest of the day passed in a haze of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to run, to leave Quartzsite before she could become invested, before she could be hurt again. But another part, a part she had thought long dead, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this could be different. That evening, Mrs. Cole mentioned the harvest social at supper, expressing excitement about the dancing and the pies that would be on offer. Miss Pritchard chimed in with details about the decorations the ladies of the church had been preparing. Delilah listened in silence, her mind churning with indecision. After the meal, she retreated to her room and sat by the window, watching the sun set over the desert landscape. The scars on her hands caught the fading light, familiar and permanent. She had spent so long seeing them as marks of shame that she had forgotten they also represented survival. Her sister had not made it out of that fire. Her father had not survived the robbery, but she had. She carried the evidence of those tragedies on her skin, yes, but she also carried the proof that she was still alive. Quincy's words echoed in her mind. "Your scars make you real." What if he was right? What if the very things she had been taught to hide were actually evidence of her strength? The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating, a possibility she had never allowed herself to consider. By the time Saturday arrived, Delilah had made her decision. She would attend the harvest social, but she would go alone on her own terms. If she happened to encounter Quincy there, she would thank him for his invitation and see where the evening led. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. She chose her best dress, a deep green calico that brought out the hints of gold in her brown eyes. She pinned her hair carefully, allowing a few soft curls to frame her face, and deliberately left her bonnet behind. If she was going to do this, she would do it without hiding. The church was lit with lanterns when she arrived, their warm glow spilling out into the evening. Music drifted from inside, a fiddle and a guitar playing a lively tune. Delilah's courage nearly failed her at the threshold, but she forced herself to step inside. The social hall was crowded with townspeople, all dressed in their Sunday best. Tables laden with food lined one wall, while couples danced in the center of the room. Children ran between the adults, their laughter adding to the festive atmosphere. Delilah felt conspicuously alone as she stood near the entrance, searching for a familiar face. "Miss Thornton." The voice came from behind her, and she turned to find Quincy approaching, his expression both pleased and surprised. "You came." "I came," she confirmed, her voice steadier than she felt, "on my own." A smile tugged at the corner of Quincy's mouth. "I can see that. It is good to see you here. Before Delilah could respond, a woman approached them with a friendly smile. She was perhaps 30, with kind eyes and a warm demeanor. "Quincy, are you going to introduce me to your friend? Miss Thornton, this is Rachel Morrison. She runs the school with Miss Pritchard. Rachel, this is Delilah Thornton. She works at Patterson's store." Rachel extended her hand without hesitation, her gaze taking in Delilah's scars with nothing more than mild interest. "It is lovely to meet you properly. I have heard wonderful things about your sewing from Mrs. Patterson. She said you repaired her wedding dress after her youngest child spilled berry juice all over it." "It was a challenging project," Delilah admitted, shaking Rachel's hand, "but I was glad to help." "Well, you have a fan in her. She has been telling everyone how talented you are." Rachel glanced between Delilah and Quincy with a knowing expression. "I will leave you two to enjoy the evening. But Delilah, I hope we can talk more later. I would love to hear about where you are from." As Rachel moved away, Delilah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. The interaction had been normal, friendly even, without the undercurrent of pity or disgust she had come to expect. "Would you like something to drink?" Quincy asked. Mrs. Henderson made her famous apple cider. They made their way to the refreshment table, and Quincy poured them both cups of cider. As they stood sipping the sweet, spiced drink, other townspeople approached to greet Quincy and exchange pleasantries. To Delilah's surprise, most of them included her in the conversation naturally, asking about her work at the store or commenting on the fine weather. When the fiddle struck up a waltz, Quincy set down his cup and turned to her. "Would you do me the honor of dancing with me?" Delilah's heart hammered in her chest. Dancing meant being close to him, meant being watched by everyone in the room, but she had come here to take a risk, to stop hiding. "I would like that," she heard herself say. Quincy led her onto the floor with the confidence of a man who knew how to dance, but did not feel the need to show off. His hand was warm and steady on her waist, his other hand holding hers gently. As they began to move to the music, Delilah was acutely aware of the eyes on them, of the whispers that undoubtedly followed. "Look at me," Quincy said softly. "Not at them." She lifted her gaze to meet his, and the rest of the room seemed to fade away. He was not the most handsome man she had ever seen, but there was something compelling about him, a steadiness that made her feel anchored. "Why did you ask me to come with you?" she asked as they turned gracefully across the floor. "You could have invited any woman in this town." "But I wanted to invite you," Quincy replied. "I have been watching you, Delilah. I have seen how hard you work, how kind you are to customers even when they do not deserve it, how you hold your head high even when you think no one is looking. You are not like anyone else I have met." "Because I am scarred," she said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "No," Quincy said firmly. "Because you are brave. Because you are honest. Because when I look at you, I see someone who has been through hell and came out the other side with her dignity intact. That is rare, Delilah. That is beautiful." Tears pricked at Delilah's eyes and she blinked them back furiously. She could not remember the last time anyone had called her beautiful, had looked at her with anything other than pity or discomfort. "You do not know what you are asking for," she whispered. "I have nightmares. I wake up screaming sometimes. I flinch at loud noises. I am not whole." "None of us are whole," Quincy said. "We are all carrying something, at least you are honest about it." The waltz ended, and they stood facing each other in the middle of the floor as other couples moved around them. Delilah felt as if she stood on the edge of a precipice, one step away from falling into something terrifying and wonderful. "I am afraid," she admitted. "Of me, of trusting, of hoping, of being rejected again when you realize how broken I really am." Quincy's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her scar with a tenderness that made her breath catch. You are not broken, Delilah. You are scarred. There is a difference. Broken things cannot function. But you wake up every morning and face a world that has been cruel to you and you keep going. That is not broken. That is the strongest thing I have ever seen. Something inside Delilah's chest cracked open, a dam breaking after years of holding back. She realized she was crying, tears streaming down her face in front of half the town, but she could not seem to stop. Quincy pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her as she shook with the force of emotions too long suppressed. "Come on," he murmured into her hair. "Let us get you some air." He guided her out of the social hall and into the cool evening, his arm steady around her shoulders. They walked away from the church, toward a small grove of mesquite trees that provided privacy from the main road. Delilah leaned against one of the trees, trying to compose herself. "I am sorry," she managed. "I did not mean to make a scene." "You did not make a scene," Quincy assured her. "You had a moment. It happens to everyone, not to you. You are always so calm, so steady." A wry smile crossed Quincy's face. "I cry sometimes too. Usually alone in my room at the livery. Usually when something reminds me of my family. But just because you do not see it does not mean it does not happen." Delilah wiped at her face with her hands, aware that she must look a mess. "Mr. Patterson told me what happened to your family. I am sorry for your loss. Thank you. It was a long time ago, but it never really leaves you, does it? The grief just becomes part of who you are." "No," Delilah agreed. "It does not leave. I still see my sister's face sometimes, still smell the smoke." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the social drifting faintly through the night air. Then Quincy spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "I came to Quartzsite because I could not stand the pity in people's eyes back in Texas. Everyone knew my story, knew what I had lost. They meant well, but their kindness felt like a weight I could not carry. I wanted to go somewhere I could just be Quincy, not the tragic young man who buried his whole family." "That is exactly why I came here," Delilah said, surprised by how much she related to his experience. "I wanted to disappear, to be invisible." "But you are not invisible, Delilah. You cannot be, not with the way you shine." She looked at him sharply. "Shine? Are you mocking me?" "No," Quincy said, his expression serious. "I am telling you the truth. You have a light in you, a strength that draws people. I saw it the first day you rode into town, exhausted and wary but determined. You were not going to let life beat you down, no matter what it had already taken from you." Delilah wanted to argue, to deny what he was saying, but something in his tone stopped her. He believed what he was saying. He truly saw her that way. "I do not know how to do this," she confessed. "How to let someone care about me. How to trust that you will not leave when you see all the broken pieces." "Then let me show you," Quincy said. "Give me a chance to prove that I am not going anywhere." The request was simple, but the implications were enormous. Delilah had spent years protecting herself, building walls to keep the pain out. Letting someone in meant risking everything, meant opening herself up to the possibility of being hurt again. But as she looked into Quincy's honest brown eyes, she realized that maybe the risk was worth it. Maybe spending the rest of her life alone and safe was not really living at all. "All right," she whispered. "All right, I will try." The smile that broke across Quincy's face was like sunrise after a long night, warm and full of promise. He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers, and for the first time in years, Delilah allowed herself to feel hope. They returned to the social, and this time when people looked at them, Delilah did not see judgment in their eyes. Perhaps it had never been there, or perhaps she had simply been too afraid to look closely. Either way, she found herself relaxing, laughing at jokes, and even dancing again. As the evening wore on, Rachel Morrison pulled her aside with a conspiratorial smile. I am glad to see you and Quincy together. He has been alone for too long, and between you and me, he has been talking about you since the day you arrived." "He has." Delilah could not hide her surprise. "Oh yes, he was quite impressed by how you handled yourself, said you had backbone." The comment made Delilah laugh, a genuine sound that felt rusty from disuse. "I am not sure backbone is the word I would use." "Well, whatever you call it, it is good to see him smile like that again, and it is good to see you here. You should come to the ladies' sewing circle on Thursday afternoons. We meet at the church and work on quilts for families in need. Your skills would be a wonderful addition." Delilah found herself agreeing, touched by the invitation. As she and Quincy left the social together later that evening, him insisting on walking her back to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time: belonging. They walked slowly through the quiet streets of Quartzsite, neither of them in a hurry to end the evening. The desert night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. "Thank you for tonight," Delilah said as they approached the boarding house. "For asking me, for dancing with me, for seeing me." "Thank you for taking a chance," Quincy replied. "I know it was not easy." They stood on the porch, and for a moment Delilah thought he might kiss her. Her heart raced at the possibility, equal parts terrified and excited. But Quincy simply lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her scarred knuckles. "Good night, Delilah," he said softly. "I will see you tomorrow." As she watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the darkness, Delilah touched her hand where he had kissed it, a smile playing at her lips. Tomorrow. There would be a tomorrow, and perhaps many more after that. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest Delilah had known since before the fire. She attended the sewing circle and found genuine friendship among the women there. Mrs. Patterson, Rachel Morrison, and several others welcomed her warmly, admiring her skill with a needle and listening with sympathy when she carefully shared parts of her story. Quincy called on her regularly, always with some excuse, bringing her lunch at the store, asking her opinion on a new saddle design, or simply walking her home after work. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future, their fears and dreams. Delilah learned that Quincy had come to Quartzsite 5 years ago with nothing but a broken heart and a determination to survive. He had worked odd jobs at first, saving every penny until he could afford to lease the livery stable. He had a gift with horses, a patience and understanding that made even the most fractious animals calm under his hands. "I think animals sense when someone has been through hard times," he told her one afternoon as they stood in the stable, watching a mare nuzzle her foal. "They know you are not going to hurt them because you understand what hurt feels like." "Is that why you understand me?" Delilah asked, only half joking. Quincy looked at her seriously. "I understand you because we are alike. We have both lost everything and had to build ourselves back from nothing. That creates a bond." As October turned to November, their relationship deepened. Quincy took her on a picnic in the desert, spreading a blanket among the cacti and sharing sandwiches while they watched the sunset paint the rocks in shades of gold and crimson. Delilah found herself laughing more, relaxing into a comfort she had thought impossible. But peace never lasted forever, and Delilah's past had a way of catching up with her. One morning in late November, a stranger rode into town, a well-dressed man in his 40s with calculating eyes. Delilah was working at the store when he entered, and something about him made her skin crawl. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, keeping her voice professional. The man's eyes swept over her, lingering on her scars with an expression that made her want to cover her face. "I am looking for someone," he said. "A woman named Delilah Thornton. I was told she might be in this area." Delilah's blood ran cold. "What do you want with her?" "That is my business." "Do you know where I can find her?" Before Delilah could respond, Mr. Patterson emerged from the back room, his expression protective. "Who is asking?" The stranger pulled out a card and handed it to Mr. Patterson. "My name is Edmund Carlyle. I am an attorney from Tucson. Miss Thornton is the beneficiary of a substantial inheritance from her late grandmother, and I need to discuss the matter with her." The words did not make sense at first. Delilah's grandmother had died when she was a child, long before the fire. "There must be some mistake," she said carefully. "My grandmother has been dead for 15 years. Edmund Carlyle's sharp eyes focused on her with sudden interest. "Ah, so you are Delilah Thornton. No, there is no mistake. I am referring to your maternal grandmother, Constance Waverly. She passed away 6 months ago and left you her estate in her will." Delilah felt the floor tilt beneath her. Her mother's mother, Constance, had cut off all contact with the family when Delilah's mother married against her wishes. Delilah had met the woman only once as a baby, according to stories her mother told. "Why would she leave me anything? She disowned my mother." "That is something I cannot answer," Carlyle said, "but the will is quite clear. You are to inherit her property, which includes a house in Tucson and a sum of approximately $5,000. $5,000. It was a fortune, more money than Delilah had ever imagined possessing. It could buy her security, independence, a future without worry. But as she looked at the attorney's calculating expression, she felt only suspicion. "I need to think about this," she said. "Can you give me some time?" Carlyle's expression soured. "Miss Thornton, this is not a small matter. There are legal proceedings that must be completed, papers that need to be signed. I have traveled a considerable distance to find you. Then you can travel a little further while I consider my options," Delilah said firmly. "Mr. Patterson, do we have any more of those leather straps Mr. Carlyle might be interested in purchasing?" Taking the hint, Mr. Patterson smoothly redirected the attorney's attention to merchandise, giving Delilah a chance to slip into the back room. Her hands were shaking as she tried to process what had just happened. An inheritance. A fortune. But from a woman who had rejected her own daughter for marrying for love rather than money. When her shift ended, Delilah went straight to the livery, needing to talk to the one person she trusted. She found Quincy repairing a wagon wheel, his shirt sleeves rolled up and a focused expression on his face. When he saw her, his expression immediately shifted to concern. "What happened? You look like you have seen a ghost." Delilah told him everything, the words tumbling out in a rush. When she finished, Quincy set down his tools and pulled her into his arms, letting her lean against his solid warmth. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I do not know. Part of me thinks this is some kind of trick, that it cannot be real. But another part thinks about what $5,000 could mean: security, a home, the ability to choose my own path instead of always scrambling for survival." "Those are all good things," Quincy said carefully, "but I hear a but in your voice." Delilah pulled back to look at him. "But it means going back to Tucson, the place where people called me cursed. It means dealing with lawyers and estates and a grandmother I never knew, and it means—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "It means leaving Quartzsite," Quincy finished for her. "Leaving me." The pain in his voice matched the ache in her chest. "I just found you," she whispered. "I just started to believe that I could have something good, and now this." Quincy cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones gently. "Listen to me, Delilah. If this inheritance is real, you should take it. You deserve security and comfort. You deserve to not have to worry about where your next meal is coming from or whether you can afford your rent. But what about us? We will figure it out. Tucson is not on the other side of the world. I can visit. You can visit, and maybe. He paused, seeming to gather courage. Maybe when the legal matters are settled, you could come back here, or I could come there. I can run a livery stable anywhere. You would do that. You would leave Quartzsite for me. Delilah, I would follow you into the desert with nothing but the clothes on my back if that is what it took to be with you. You are the first person since I lost my family who has made me feel like life is worth more than just surviving. I am not going to let you go without a fight. Delilah kissed him then, pouring all her fear and hope and love into the contact. It was their first real kiss, and it felt like coming home and setting off on an adventure all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. I love you, Delilah said, the words escaping before she could stop them. I know it has only been a few months, but I love you, Quincy Thatcher. Thank God, Quincy said, his forehead resting against hers. I have been in love with you since you stumbled off your horse and glared at me like I was personally responsible for every bad thing that had ever happened to you. They laughed together, the sound breaking the tension. Whatever happened with the inheritance, they would face it together. Delilah was not alone anymore, and that made all the difference. The next morning, Delilah met with Edmund Carlyle at the hotel where he was staying. Quincy accompanied her, standing silent and supportive at her side as the attorney laid out the details of the inheritance. It was all legitimate, complete with copies of the will and documentation proving Delilah's identity as Constance Waverley's granddaughter. Your grandmother was a complicated woman, Carlyle explained. She spent the last years of her life regretting her estrangement from your mother. When she learned of your family's deaths in the fire, she was devastated. She spent considerable time trying to locate you, and when she finally did, she decided to leave you everything as a way of making amends. She knew I survived, Delilah asked, her voice small. She knew, and she never reached out. She feared you would reject her as she had rejected your mother. Pride is a powerful thing, Miss Thornton. By the time she overcame it, she was too ill to travel. The will was her way of trying to help you from beyond the grave. It was a sad story, made sadder by the waste of it all. If her grandmother had simply reached out, they might have had years together. But regret was useless now. All Delilah could do was accept what was being offered and try to make the best of it. She agreed to travel to Tucson to handle the legal proceedings, with the understanding that it would take several weeks to settle everything. Quincy insisted on accompanying her, closing the livery temporarily and arranging for a friend to handle any emergencies. You are not doing this alone, he said firmly when she tried to argue. We are in this together. They departed Quartzsite a week later after Delilah gave notice at the general store and said goodbye to the friends she had made. Mrs. Henderson pulled her aside before they left, pressing a small package into her hands. For the journey, the older woman said gruffly. And you take care of yourself, girl. You have grown on me, scars and all. The comment, meant kindly, still made Delilah's eyes sting with tears. She had never expected to find acceptance in Quartzsite, let alone affection. Thank you for everything, Mrs. Henderson, for taking a chance on me. Quincy Thatcher is a good judge of character, Mrs. Henderson replied. If he saw something special in you, I figured I should pay attention. Turns out he was right. The journey to Tucson took 3 days by stage, and Delilah found herself dreading their arrival more with each passing mile. This was the city where she had been rejected, where people had whispered about her being cursed. Returning felt like walking back into a nightmare. Quincy seemed to sense her anxiety. He held her hand throughout the journey, offering quiet reassurance and distracting her with stories from his childhood in Texas. By the time they reached Tucson, Delilah felt fortified by his presence, ready to face whatever awaited. The house Delilah had inherited was a substantial adobe structure on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a walled garden that had gone wild in the months since her grandmother's death. It was both grander and sadder than Delilah had imagined, a testament to a lonely woman's life. Over the next several weeks, Delilah worked with Mr. Carlyle to settle the estate. There were endless papers to sign, accounts to close, and possessions to sort through. She found herself learning about the grandmother she had never known through the woman's belongings. Books on history and philosophy, beautiful but impractical gowns, letters tied with ribbon that spoke of lost love and bitter regrets. One letter in particular struck Delilah deeply. It was addressed to her but never sent, written in her grandmother's shaky hand just weeks before her death. "My dear Delilah," it read, "I am a foolish old woman with more pride than sense. I rejected your mother because she chose love over wealth, and in doing so, I lost the most precious thing I had. I have thought of you every day since I learned of the tragedy that took your family. You survived when others did not, and that takes a strength I never possessed. I hope this inheritance can provide you with security and freedom. Use it to build a life your mother would have been proud of. I am sorry I never had the courage to say these things in person. Your loving grandmother, Constance." Delilah showed the letter to Quincy that evening as they sat in the garden watching the sunset. He read it carefully, then pulled her close. "She understood you," he said quietly. "Even without meeting you, she understood that you are a survivor." "I wish I could have known her," Delilah admitted. "I wish I could have told her that I forgive her. Maybe she knew anyway. Maybe that is why she left you everything." As the legal proceedings dragged on, Delilah found herself restless in Tucson. The city held too many bad memories, too many people who remembered her as the cursed girl. But as she walked through the house she had inherited, exploring its rooms and imagining what could be done with it, an idea began to form. "What if we did not sell this place?" she asked Quincy one evening. "What if we turned it into something useful? Like what? A home for women who have nowhere else to go. Women like me who have been scarred by life and rejected by society. We could offer them shelter, help them find work, give them a chance to rebuild." Quincy's eyes lit up with understanding. "You want to give others what you were looking for when you came to Quartzsite?" "Yes. And with the money from the inheritance, we could afford to do it properly. We could hire teachers, offer training and useful skills, create a real refuge." It was an ambitious plan, but the more Delilah thought about it, the more right it felt. She had been given an incredible gift, not just the money but the chance to make a difference. She could use her own painful experiences to help others who were suffering. They spent weeks developing the idea, consulting with local churches and charitable organizations about the need for such a home. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Tucson, like many frontier cities, had its share of women who fell through the cracks. Widows, orphans, women escaping abuse, former prostitutes seeking a new life. But as the project took shape, Delilah found herself missing Quartzsite with an intensity that surprised her. She missed the small town simplicity, the desert landscape, the friends she had made. Tucson felt too big, too full of painful memories. It was not home. One night in January of 1879, as Delilah and Quincy sat planning the details of the women's home, she voiced what had been growing in her heart. "I do not want to stay here. I know this house is perfect for the project and I want to see it through. But once it is established, once we have staff in place and women being helped, I want to go back to Quartzsite." Quincy set down the papers he had been reviewing and looked at her intently. "Are you sure? This is your inheritance, your grandmother's legacy. My grandmother's legacy is helping women who have been rejected by society. That work can continue without me living here. But Quartzsite is where I found myself again, where I learned that my scars do not define me. That is where I want to build my life, with you." "Then that is what we will do," Quincy said simply. "We will establish this home, make sure it is running properly, and then we will go back to Quartzsite together." "You really would do that?" "Give up everything here to return to a small desert town." Quincy reached across the table to take her hands. "Delilah, you are my home. Wherever you are is where I want to be. Besides, Quartzsite needs a good livery stable, and I already know all the horses." They sealed the decision with a kiss, and for the first time since leaving Quartzsite, Delilah felt truly at peace with the path forward. The next several months were a whirlwind of activity. They hired a staff for the women's home, including a former teacher named Mrs. Elizabeth Grant, who would serve as the director. The house was renovated to accommodate multiple residents, with rooms for living quarters, workspaces for learning trades, and common areas for meals and socializing. Delilah personally interviewed each of the first residents, seeing echoes of her own story in their faces. There was Margaret, a widow whose burned scars from a cooking accident had made her unemployable. Sarah, a young woman who had survived an Apache raid that killed her family and left her with a limp. Ellen, whose face bore the marks of smallpox and years of abuse from a cruel husband. To each of them, Delilah offered the same message: "Your scars do not make you less, they make you real. They show you have survived." The women's home opened its doors in March of 1879, and word spread quickly through Tucson about the refuge for scarred women. Delilah was surprised and touched by the community support, with local businesses donating supplies and individuals offering to teach skills like sewing, cooking, and bookkeeping. But even as she poured her energy into making the home a success, Delilah's heart was already back in Quartzsite with the life she and Quincy were building together. They had been officially courting for nearly 6 months, and there was no doubt in either of their minds where the relationship was heading. One evening in early April, as they walked through the renovated garden of the women's home, Quincy stopped beneath a flowering Palo Verde tree and turned to face her. The setting sun cast golden light across his features, making his brown eyes glow with warmth. "Delilah Thornton," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion she could see in his face. "You are the strongest, most courageous woman I have ever met. You took your scars and turned them into something beautiful, something that is helping others heal. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. Will you marry me?" He did not have a ring, did not drop to one knee, but the sincerity in his voice and the love in his eyes were worth more than any grand gesture. Delilah felt tears streaming down her face as she answered, "Yes. Yes, I will marry you, Quincy Thatcher." He swept her into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed and cried simultaneously. When he set her down, he kissed her deeply, and Delilah felt every broken piece of her heart knit back together. She was whole, not in spite of her scars, but because of them, because they had led her to this moment, to this man. They married in May in a simple ceremony at the Tucson church, with Mrs. Grant and several of the residents from the women's home in attendance. Rachel Morrison traveled all the way from Quartzsite to stand as Delilah's witness, bringing warm wishes from the entire town. For her wedding, Delilah wore a dress she had sewn herself, a simple but elegant gown of ivory silk. She did not wear a veil to cover her scars. Instead, she pinned flowers in her hair and walked down the aisle with her head held high, proud of everything that had brought her to this moment. Quincy's eyes never left her face as she approached, and when he took her hands, she felt the rightness of it down to her bones. They spoke their vows clearly, promising to love each other through whatever hardships life might bring, to be partners in all things, to build a future together. "I, Quincy, take you, Delilah, to be my wife," he said. "Your scars make you real and your strength makes you beautiful. I promise to love you, honor you, and stand beside you for all the days of my life." "I, Delilah, take you, Quincy, to be my husband," she replied, her voice strong and clear. "You saw past my scars to the woman beneath, and you gave me the courage to see her too. I promise to love you, honor you, and build a life with you filled with laughter, hope, and endless tomorrows." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Quincy kissed her with such tenderness that Delilah felt her heart might burst. They were married partners, a team ready to face whatever came next. After the ceremony, there was a small celebration at the women's home. The residents had prepared a feast, and someone produced a fiddle for dancing. As Delilah and Quincy took their first dance as husband and wife, surrounded by people who loved and supported them, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. "Are you happy?" Quincy murmured as they swayed together. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Delilah replied honestly. "Thank you for seeing me, for loving me. Thank you for letting me," Quincy said, "for taking a chance on a cowboy who fell in love with your courage." They left Tucson a week later, returning to Quartzsite as husband and wife. The town welcomed them back with genuine warmth, and several people mentioned that they had been hoping Quincy and Delilah would end up together. Mrs. Henderson gave them her blessing and a knowing smile, while Mr. Patterson joked that he had lost his best seamstress, but gained a friend. Quincy reopened the livery stable, and business quickly returned to its previous steady pace. Delilah, no longer needing to work for wages thanks to the inheritance, spent her time volunteering at the church, teaching sewing to young girls, and staying involved with the Tucson Women's Home through correspondence and occasional visits. They rented a small house on the edge of town, a modest adobe structure with a garden where Delilah planted vegetables and flowers. It was nothing grand, but it was theirs, a home built on love and mutual respect. The first year of their marriage was filled with joy and adjustment. They learned each other's rhythms, their habits and quirks. Quincy discovered that Delilah sang while she cooked, old songs her mother had taught her. Delilah learned that Quincy liked to read in the evenings, particularly adventure novels that took him far from the desert. There were difficult moments, too. Delilah still had nightmares sometimes, waking with her sister's name on her lips and terror in her heart. But now, when she woke, Quincy was there, holding her and reminding her that she was safe, that the past could not hurt her anymore. In the spring of 1880, Delilah discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She had lost so much in her life that the idea of bringing a child into the world felt impossibly risky. But Quincy's excitement was infectious, and slowly, she allowed herself to hope. The pregnancy was not easy. Delilah suffered from sickness in the early months and fatigue that made even simple tasks exhausting. But the women of Quartzsite rallied around her, bringing meals, offering advice, and assuring her that everything would be fine. Rachel Morrison was particularly supportive, visiting regularly and sharing stories of her own sister's pregnancies. "Your body knows what to do," she assured Delilah. "You are stronger than you think." As her belly grew round with new life, Delilah found herself healing in ways she had not expected. The miracle of creation happening inside her body reminded her that she was not just a collection of scars and traumas. She was a living, breathing woman capable of bringing new life into the world. Quincy was attentive and doting, treating Delilah as if she were made of spun glass. She had to remind him regularly that she was pregnant, not dying, and that she could still function normally. But his concern came from a place of love, and she found it endearing even when it was frustrating. In December of 1880, during one of the coldest winters Quartzsite had seen in years, Delilah went into labor. The baby came quickly, as if eager to enter the world, and after several hours of intense pain and effort, Delilah held her son for the first time. He was perfect, with a shock of dark hair in his father's brown eyes. Quincy cried when he held him, tears streaming down his face as he marveled at the tiny life they had created together. "What should we name him?" Delilah asked, exhausted but elated. Quincy looked at her with so much love that it took her breath away. "What about James? After my father, James Thatcher," Delilah said, testing the name. "I love it." Their son thrived, growing strong and healthy. Delilah threw herself into motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else, learning as she went and accepting help when she needed it. Quincy was a devoted father, often carrying James around the livery stable, introducing him to the horses and telling him stories. As the months passed and James grew, Delilah found herself reflecting on how far she had come. 2 years ago, she had ridden into Quartzsite broken and alone, convinced that her scars made her unworthy of love or happiness. Now she had a husband who adored her, a son she cherished, a home filled with warmth, and a community that accepted her. One afternoon, when James was about 6 months old, Delilah was sitting on the porch of their house, nursing him in the shade. Quincy came home from the livery and sat beside her, his arm draping casually over her shoulders. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I was thinking about what you said when we first met, about being scarred and damaged." Delilah looked at him curiously. "What about it? Do you still feel that way? Do you still think your scars make you less?" She considered the question carefully, looking down at her son's peaceful face as he nursed. The scars were still there, of course. The mark on her face, the burns on her hands, the invisible wounds that sometimes still ached, but they did not define her anymore. "No," she said finally. "I do not feel that way anymore. The scars are part of my story, part of what made me who I am, but they are not all of me. I am also a wife, a mother, a friend, a survivor. The scars just show that I lived through something terrible and kept going." "Your scars make you real," Quincy said, echoing the words that had changed everything between them. "They always did." Delilah leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steadiness that had become her anchor. "Thank you for seeing that, for helping me see it too." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the desert sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. James finished nursing and fell asleep in Delilah's arms, his tiny fist curled against her chest. "I love our life," Delilah said softly. "I never thought I could have this. A family, a home, peace." "We built it together," Quincy replied, "and we will keep building it day by day." As the years passed, the Thatcher family grew and flourished. James was joined by a sister, Emma, 2 years later, and then another brother, Daniel, 2 years after that. The small house became crowded with noise and laughter, with children's toys and family meals. Delilah continued her work helping women through the Tucson home, which had grown substantially since its founding. She made several trips each year to visit, always returning with stories of women who had found hope and new beginnings. The work filled her with purpose and reminded her of how far she had come. Quincy's livery stable became one of the most successful businesses in Quartzsite, known throughout the territory for fair prices and quality work. He trained each of their children to work with horses, passing on his gift for understanding the animals. The scars never faded, of course. Time could heal many things, but it could not erase the physical marks of Delilah's past. Yet as the years went by, she found that she thought about them less and less. They were simply part of her, no more significant than the color of her eyes or the sound of her laugh. Sometimes strangers would stare or children would ask innocent questions about the marks on her face and hands. Delilah learned to answer honestly but without shame. "I was in a fire when I was younger," she would say. "It hurt terribly, but I survived. These scars show that I am strong." Her own children never saw the scars as anything unusual. To them, their mother was simply beautiful, the person who sang them to sleep and kissed their scraped knees and told them stories. Emma liked to trace the line on Delilah's face with her small fingers, saying it looked like a river on a map. "Where does your river go, Mama?" she asked once. "It goes from the past to the future," Delilah told her. "It reminds me that I can survive hard things and still find happiness." On their 10th wedding anniversary, Quincy surprised Delilah with a trip back to Tucson to visit the women's home. They left the children with Mrs. Henderson, who had become like a grandmother to them, and made the journey together. The home had expanded significantly, now housing over 30 women at a time and offering training in various trades. Mrs. Grant met them at the door, her face creasing into a warm smile. "Delilah, Quincy. It is so wonderful to see you both. Come in, come in." The women have been so excited to meet the founder. They spent the day touring the facility, meeting residents and hearing success stories. Women who had arrived broken and hopeless were now learning skills, finding employment, and rebuilding their lives. Several of the original residents had moved on to independent lives, while a few had stayed on as staff, wanting to help others the way they had been helped. One young woman in particular caught Delilah's attention. She was perhaps 19, with scars that looked like they came from a knife attack. She hung back from the others, her eyes wary and defensive. Delilah approached her gently. "Hello, I am Delilah Thatcher. What is your name?" "Catherine," the girl said quietly. "They told me you started this place." "I did. Well, my grandmother's money started it, but the idea came from my own experiences." Catherine's eyes flicked to Delilah's face, noting the prominent scar. "Did someone hurt you too, not intentionally?" "I was in a fire. But yes, life hurt me. It took people I loved and left me marked and alone. For a long time I thought those marks meant I was worthless." "What changed?" Catherine asked, and Delilah could hear the desperate hope in her voice. "I met someone who saw past the scars," Delilah said, glancing at Quincy, who was talking with Mrs. Grant across the room. "He helped me understand that surviving something terrible does not make you damaged. It makes you strong. Your scars prove you lived through the worst and you are still here. That is worth more than any unblemished skin." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "I am afraid no one will ever want me like this. I am ruined." Delilah took the girl's hands in hers, squeezing gently. "You are not ruined, you are healing. And the right person will see your strength, not your scars. Trust me, I know." She spent another hour talking with Catherine, sharing her own story and offering encouragement. When she and Quincy finally left the home that evening, Delilah felt renewed in her sense of purpose. "Thank you for bringing me here," she told Quincy as they walked through Tucson's evening streets. "I needed the reminder of why this work matters." "You help more people than you know," Quincy said, "not just through the home but through your example. You show people that scars do not have to be the end of the story." They returned to Quartzsite reinvigorated, ready to embrace the next chapter of their lives. The children were growing quickly, James already talking about learning to run the livery stable like his father, Emma showing a talent for drawing, and Daniel proving to be a natural with animals. Life in Quartzsite continued its steady rhythm. There were challenges, of course. Droughts that made water scarce, occasional conflicts with bandits passing through, illnesses that swept through the town. But the Thatcher family faced each obstacle together, their love for each other providing strength. Delilah often thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived in Quartzsite, so broken and afraid. That woman had believed her scars made her unlovable, that she was destined to spend her life alone. But she had been wrong. The scars had not prevented her from finding love. In fact, they had led her to Quincy, to a man who understood that real beauty came from surviving and persevering. On quiet evenings after the children were asleep, Delilah and Quincy would sit together on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. Sometimes they talked about their day, their dreams for the future, memories of the past. Other times they simply sat in comfortable silence, hands entwined. "You ever regret it?" Delilah asked one such evening. Taking a chance on a scarred woman who came to town with nothing but a worn-out horse and a heap of trauma, Quincy pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Never. Not for a single moment. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Delilah. You and our children, this life we built together. I would go through everything again if it meant ending up here with you. Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts, they taught us what really matters. Love, family, acceptance. Everything else is just noise." As the years turned into decades, the Thatcher family became a cornerstone of Quartzsite community. James took over the livery stable when Quincy decided to slow down, running it with the same integrity his father had demonstrated. Emma married a rancher and moved to a nearby town, though she visited often with her own growing family. Daniel became a veterinarian, one of the first in the territory, combining his love of animals with a desire to help people. Delilah continued her advocacy work for scarred and traumatized women, expanding the Tucson home's reach through fundraising and awareness. She wrote articles for newspapers about the importance of giving second chances, about seeing people for who they were rather than what had happened to them. Her words reached far beyond Arizona, inspiring similar homes to open in other territories and states. Quincy remained her constant support, always ready with encouragement or practical help. Their love deepened with time, growing from the passionate intensity of new romance into something steadier and more profound. They knew each other completely, the good and the bad, the strengths and the weaknesses, and they chose each other every single day. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered for a celebration. Children and grandchildren filled their home with noise and laughter, 3 generations united in love. As Delilah looked around at the faces she loved most in the world, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Quincy found her standing alone in the kitchen for a moment, taking it all in. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," Delilah said honestly. "How different my life turned out from what I expected. How lucky I am." "I am the lucky one," Quincy murmured. "You took a broken cowboy who had buried his whole family and gave him a reason to live again. You gave me love, children, purpose. You gave me everything." Delilah turned in his arms, looking up at his face. They were both older now, with silver threading through their hair and lines etched by years of laughter and work. But when she looked at Quincy, she still saw the man who had looked past her scars to see her heart, who had believed in her when she could not believe in herself. "We gave each other everything," she corrected. "That is what love is, building something beautiful out of broken pieces." They kissed, surrounded by the sound of their family celebrating, and Delilah knew with absolute certainty that she had found her happy ending. Not because life had become perfect or because the scars had disappeared, but because she had learned to see herself the way Quincy saw her. As someone real, someone strong, someone worthy of love. The scars would always be part of her story, visible evidence of the pain she had endured. But they were no longer the only part of her story. Now there was also love, family, purpose, and joy. The marks on her skin had not prevented her from building a beautiful life. If anything, they had made that life more precious because she understood how easily it all could have been different. As the evening wore on and the grandchildren played in the garden while the adults talked and laughed, Delilah felt a profound sense of peace. She had been rejected for being too scarred by life, cast aside as damaged goods. But Quincy had seen the truth. Her scars made her real, made her human, made her the strong, compassionate woman she had become. And that, Delilah realized, was worth more than any unblemished skin, more than any life lived without hardship. Her scars told a story of survival, of endurance, of hope. They were not marks of shame, but badges of honor, proof that she had faced the worst life could offer and emerged victorious. The sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and crimson. Delilah stood with Quincy's arm around her waist, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, and knew that she had everything she had ever wanted. She had found love, acceptance, and a place where she belonged. Her scars had not held her back. They had led her here, to this moment, to this family, to this beautiful, messy, perfectly imperfect life. And she would not change a single thing. Years continued to pass, bringing the inevitable changes that time always brings. Quincy's hair turned completely white, though his eyes remained as warm and steady as ever. Delilah moved a bit slower, her hands sometimes aching from decades of detailed sewing work, but her spirit remained unbroken. They celebrated the birth of great-grandchildren, watched their family tree spread and flourish. The Tucson Women's Home continued its work long after Mrs. Grant retired, with new leadership carrying on the mission. Delilah received letters regularly from women whose lives had been changed by the refuge, each one a reminder of the good that could come from turning pain into purpose. On a warm spring evening in 1905, 27 years after Delilah first rode into Quartzsite, she and Quincy sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. They were in their 70s now, their bodies showing the wear of long lives well lived. "You remember the day we met?" Delilah asked, her hand resting in Quincy's. "Every detail," Quincy replied. "You were dusty and defensive, trying so hard to hide your face. I thought you were the most interesting person I had ever seen. I thought you were going to reject me like everyone else had. And instead I fell in love with you." Delilah smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Best decision I ever made was giving you a chance, giving us a chance." "Second best," Quincy corrected gently. "The best decision you made was deciding that you deserved happiness, scars and all." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the desert in gold and shadow. Delilah thought about all the years they had shared, all the joys and sorrows, triumphs and struggles. It had not always been easy, but it had always been worth it. "I love you, Quincy Thatcher," she said softly. "Thank you for seeing me when I could not see myself." "I love you, Delilah Thatcher," he replied, pressing a kiss to her scarred temple. "Thank you for letting me, for trusting me with your heart." As darkness fell and stars began to emerge in the vast sky above, Delilah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had been broken, scarred, and alone, convinced that life had nothing left to offer. But she had been wrong. Life had offered her everything: love, family, purpose, and peace. Her scars had not defined her. They had refined her, shaping her into someone stronger and more compassionate than she ever could have been without them. And in the end, that made all the difference. The woman who had ridden into Quartzsite all those years ago, hiding her face and her heart, no longer existed. In her place was someone who had learned that scars were not something to be ashamed of, but something to be honored. They told a story of survival, of courage, of hope. And it was a story with the happiest of endings. A life filled with love, a family that brought joy, and the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Delilah closed her eyes, feeling the warm evening breeze on her face and Quincy's steady presence beside her. She had found her home, not just in Quartzsite but in the life they had built together. Her scars had led her here to this moment, to this perfect contentment, and she would not have changed a single thing,